Hello. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Turning back on my video. Okay. Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Great start. Your background looks good. No glare in the background. So that's good. I do see your, well, I guess you're going to share your screen anyway. I see the PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's not going to do me any good to shift this a little bit. So yeah, it's gonna stay there. Just like that. All right, I've got all of my screens up, I think. Let me get this situated appropriately. Got the session notes showing up. I'm gonna, oh darn, okay.
Okay.
All right, so I have this whole thing set up so that I can see my notes on my laptop because that's where my camera is, but that means that I have to either, well, no, actually, never mind. That's fine. I can show the chat for the session.
Is that fine?
I don't need to see.
When you do presentation mode, are you able to have it on one screen and still see Hopin and other things?
It's like I don't have the greatest view of Hopin if I have because I have Hopin and the notes screen on the same notes window on the same screen, but it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Or being recorded.
I know, I noticed that when I first joined. I wish I knew because I was like fixing some things in the background, but sorry. Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. Plenary, I think it went well. Maybe the glitches that you saw were only for like Lynn's segment and not for
Yeah, none of them lasted very long, so
portions. There is a little fuzziness to your voice, like a static, but it's like your voice is still clear. And I wonder if it's just my headphones.
Is this better? No?
No, yeah, I don't hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea how I would fix that. So
Yeah, and it wasn't even like, it was subtle. It wasn't like every time he spoke. It was like, I don't know. Who knows?
Who knows?
If we double click and maximize the shared screen, which I'm doing on my end, does it do it for everybody?
No, I don't
or
think
we
so.
still have to
Yeah, I think we still have to
tell folks to do it? Okay. Okey-doke. The links I'm going to share.
Oh, hooray, people are joining.
Oh, great.
Okay. Since we've got a lot of content to cover in a very short amount of time, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As people join our session, feel free to introduce yourself by putting your name and what state you're coming from. We're glad you can join us today. My name is Richelle Presume. I'm on the P-12 team at EdTrust National.
Hi,
By my colleague Ivy Smith Morgan. And today today we're going to be discussing how protecting high poverty districts from state funding cuts. Glad to see representation from Maryland. Happy to have you. We have Viviana from California. Great. All right, this is our agenda for today. First, we're going to why cuts to state education aid is an equity issue. Then we're going to discuss the equity considerations that leaders should keep in mind when making decisions about funding cuts. And lastly, you'll be able to explore a web tool that shows how different funding scenarios will play out in your state. To go through today, but we want to make sure we can answer your questions. So as you have them, feel free to drop your questions and we'll reserve some time to answer them. So why about state funding cuts? Rather than me tell you, I'm going to play this short video remind us of the reality and gravity of what we're discussing here today. As you watch, feel free to share your thoughts in the chat.
Okay, guys, it looks like I might not, can you hear that? But not audio.
But the video. Okay, everyone, we're going to continue to try to set up
There
this
we
video.
go. Sorry about that, guys.
Next budget could see a cut in funding for schools. He's proposing cutting 20%, but he's not the only one. Cities around the country are doing the same or more. It's all because of COVID-19 and causing a decline in tax revenues. Two on Your Side's Danielle Church tells us why local community members, parents, and students are refusing to let that happen in Buffalo.
Claudine, the message from all of them is pretty clear. They told me over and over again that now is not the time to cut education funding.
Especially when we got a whole lot of issues like a digital divide. Who's going to school? Who's not going to school? Some kids have not been to school in over 6 months. And so now to cut education, we feel it's the wrong time.
To voice that message, the Citizen Action Education Committee of Buffalo held a rally outside the state office building downtown. Students were also there, who say it's especially a bad idea to cut school funding when kids are already trying to get used to a school year that you can only describe in one way.
I say hell. Again, like it's students that can't even get into class right now. They are marked absence for no reason, even though they trying to be in class, but they can't because of the Wi-Fi. Like our Wi-Fi ain't that strong. And
Jennifer McCosey is the West District representative of the Buffalo Board of Education. With problems like that, she hopes Governor Cuomo will look at making cuts somewhere else.
There are many other alternatives. There's many that have been brought to the table. Some are not popular, I understand, but you know, there's ways around what we're doing right now.
Others agree, saying if the state doesn't look at making cuts elsewhere, it could mean drastic changes for schools.
They're already talking about laying off teachers' aides and teachers' assistants and paraprofessionals. What's going to be next? You're going to start laying off teachers? You're going to start laying off faculty? You're going to start closing buildings? We got to do something different. We just can't continue just to cut education.
Danielle Church, Channel 2.
All right. I hope you hear and see that video that really reminds us that cuts to education have real consequences for students, families, and communities. And as our society at large becomes more aware of the system of the country, it's critical that we call into question, we call out the historical funding and resource allocation decisions that persistently harm students of color, specifically Black and Latino students. My sound, I'm echoing a bit. Hello? Okay, well, I think it stopped. All right, so what we saw in the video is emblematic of the financial situation in the West. Given the current financial uncertainty, there are about 3 ways to approach advocacy at this moment. Okay. I'm gonna unmute and then. Hello?
I hear you. I think you sound fine right now.
Okay, I was seeing something in the chat about my sound. Okay, well, there are 3 approaches to advocacy at this moment. If we can go back. You could either get lucky and be in a state where leaders have already announced that they will not cut education spending. Projected revenue loss, or they've already identified another to make up for cuts. 2, you can push for the best case scenario by advocating for no cuts to education and pushing the state to find revenue sources with anticipate losses, either from new taxes or shifts in spending priorities, or both, if the opportunity window still exists. 3, you can work for the best so as not to undermine any efforts to avoid funding cuts together, plan for the worst by knowing what to advocate for if already decided that education cuts must be made. Specifically in this presentation, we will introduce state leaders have under the worst case scenario, so that you as advocates at the district, schools, and students with the greatest needs. Money matters in education, and cuts to state education aid have the potential to cause the most harm to students who are already in the pandemic right now. Why is that? Because the districts that are most at risk for funding cuts are those that are heavily reliant on state aid. High poverty districts, which serve more students from low-income backgrounds, tend to have lower property wealth, meaning they have less local revenue to pull from for their education budgets. And as you can see in the graph, the overwhelming majority of states try to make up for this by providing more state dollars to their highest poverty districts and their lowest poverty districts. Though across the states, that additional amount varies. High poverty districts also have populations that are heavily Black and Latino. This country's history of racist housing policies and segregation. For these reasons, if cuts to state education aid are made, it will not be felt equally. In turns, low poverty districts are able to compensate for cuts to state aid by relying more on local wealth, while high poverty districts are the same. We saw this with the last recession. Great risk of states repeating patterns from the recession. When you look at this graph, which compares the amount of education funding lost in the last recession in low poverty districts versus high poverty districts, looking just at the state for student funding, the purple, we see that between 2008 and 2012, affluent districts across the country, other education, state education, by about $500 per student. Districts lost over $1,500 per student. Massive cuts to education resulted in huge inequities. They also record-setting teacher layoffs. For example, Texas cut education budgets by billions of dollars in 2011 during the last recession. The method in which they cut funds to education high poverty districts. The funding gap between rich and poor districts increased by over $1,000. Districts lost more dollars. They ultimately laid off teachers. Funding cuts, as well as other factors related to enrollment. Texas, where the wealthiest district saw the number of teachers increase by 22%, while higher poverty districts lost 13% of their teachers. This is a huge disparity. While the Great Recession exacerbated inequities across districts, it also widened inequities within districts. Looking just at Los Angeles, you see that low-income Latino students were more likely to see their teachers laid off than their white peers in the same district. So that there are long-term consequences to education budget changes. That also outcomes, declines in education cuts were linked to declines in student achievement and decreased college-going rates. So right now, the question we have is, how do we prevent that from happening?
Yes, right. How do we prevent history from repeating itself? We've come up with a set of principles for state action and some considerations for federal action that we think will help here. At the state level, there are three main things that we think state leaders should do. One, if at all possible, protect education budgets, right? Don't cut funding at all. If that's not possible, at the very least, protect the highest need districts from cuts. and make sure those same protections are applied for high need schools within all districts. So protecting education budgets. First and foremost, right? We think state leaders need to try to protect education funding. It's barely recovered from the last recession, and in some states, it still hasn't recovered. But there is some promising news here, right? So far, the cuts that we've seen haven't been as widespread or as deep as we initially feared. The fact is, lots of states were able to protect their education budgets for this school year and last school year. And they were able to do that by dipping into reserves and using the tiny amount of CARES funding that the federal government provided to shore up their budgets for this year and last year. Going into sort of planning for the next school year, if states are going to continue to avoid cuts, they'll likely have to identify new revenue sources. They could either, raise taxes on things like cigarettes, or fix loopholes in their existing formulas that are sending additional funding to districts with lower need, like eliminating hold harmless policies. So if states have exhausted all other possibilities and they still have to make cuts, then they should design those cuts so that they protect high need districts. And here we mean districts with more student need, right? So more students from low-income families, more English learners, more students with disabilities, or districts with more fiscal need, right? So districts that have lower property wealth. And it's important to note here that often it's communities of color that have lower property wealth because of our country's, history of racist housing discrimination policies that have suppressed property wealth in those communities. In particular, right, communities of color and low-income communities are already being disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So state leaders really have a responsibility and the tools to make sure that the policy solutions that they're developing to address the pandemic and the recession aren't hurting those communities even more. And then we think states should measure impact. Funding systems are complicated, and sometimes policy solutions have unintended consequences. And so, no matter what state leaders decide to do here, how they design their funding cuts, we think it's important to actually look at the impact that the cuts are going to have on high need, high poverty districts in the state. And that's both in terms of overall dollars, teachers, other resources, and examine those changes on a per student basis, right? So that we can get a better sense of what these policy changes mean for student experience. And then the third thing, right, protecting high needs schools, it's not enough to just ensure these protections for districts, right? We know that within district funding inequities exist, within district inequities in all kinds of resources exist. They were a problem before the pandemic, and the pandemic has only exacerbated them. So it's really important to make sure that all districts are protecting their highest needs schools from disproportionate cuts. And that's in terms of funding, staff, and other resources, right? And so that could be, avoiding a first in, last out strategy for layoffs, like we saw with the example that Rachel talked about a little bit earlier, or, making sure that schools are able to keep programs to, make sure that students and families are still engaged at this time. To help enable this sort of now and in the future, we also think it's really important to report data, right? As soon as we started to feel the recession and recognize that state and local budgets would be in trouble, right, we started looking to data, right? We started trying to understand what happened during the last recession, and we had varying degrees of success with that. And so, it's really important sort of in this time of so much uncertainty to collect and report data, right? We need more, not less information to help deal with those uncertainties. Maintaining, sort of data collections around school level spending, reporting data on teacher layoffs will help us improve our understanding both in the short term and in the long term in terms of, you know, the implications of state and local responses to the pandemic. Okay, we're going to take a break from us talking for a second, and we want to hear from you guys. So I want to do a Mentimeter poll with your spare devices. If you want to participate, go to menti.com and enter the code that you see on the screen, 1261716, and let us know what you're hearing, what you know about what's going on in your state right now regarding funding cuts. And if you'd like to share more information than you can share in the poll, feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat. Yeah, so I mean, it's great to see that that the majority of you guys know that your state is not planning to make cuts right now. That's fantastic. We are, you know, we've been worried about states making cuts for the past 6 months, and have heard so far that states just aren't in that position right now. But we are looking, you know, and sort of expecting the conversations to shift. In the new year when states start their new legislative sessions. And so, you know, the federal government can help here. They can help by providing more money, and we think that that additional funding should come with strings, right? It seems pretty much guaranteed right now in this moment that we're not going to see any more action on the federal side before the election, but we know that CARES was not enough. And so we're still advocating for Congress to provide additional funding that includes at least $175 billion for K-12 education, you know, when they return after the elections. And, you know, we think that that funding should come with strings that basically require states to do all of the things that I just said before, right? So maintaining education spending, either in terms of like absolute levels or in terms of effort, right? So if the state was spending 20% of all its funding on education before the recession, before the pandemic, then we would expect states to continue spending 20% on education, even if the total pie that they have available to them has shrunk. And then, you know, again, right, ensuring that high poverty districts receive lower cuts, ensuring that high poverty schools across all districts receive lower cuts, and reporting data, right? All of that is critically important to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Okay, so, right, even if Congress doesn't do anything when they return after the elections, states still have really important decisions to make here. And I'm going to talk a little bit to try to make that more concrete. Okay, so right there, if a state decides that it needs to make cuts, you know, if they just really can't make it work to protect their education budgets, then there are a number of ways that states can actually go ahead and make those cuts. We tend to think about them on a scale or a spectrum from inequitable to equal but inequitable to, you know, sort of somewhat or more equitable. So one way that we would call inequitable would be to cut a flat percentage of total state aid, right? And so this kind of mechanism is already built into some state school funding formulas to deal with budget shortfalls. It seems fair on its surface, right? You cut the same percentage from every district, but because states tend to send more funding to higher needs districts, this is actually not fair, right? And it would cut more from the districts that it sends more to. So another way that we've been thinking about, that we see sometimes, and this is something that Michigan does for sure, is to cut the same amount per student, right? Which also, seems fair on the surface, but it treats all students equally, and equal isn't equitable, right? Students don't have the same needs, and society doesn't treat students the same way. So our school funding policy shouldn't do that either. So it's no surprise that we call that method equal but inequitable. There are also more equitable ways for states to make cuts. There are lots of ways, right? The one that we've been thinking about the most is one that reduces funding on a sliding scale based on a district's percentage of students in poverty and a district's local revenue per student, right? So that districts with higher than average poverty and lower than average wealth will see smaller cuts than other districts. And then, of course, it's worth saying just one more time here that even as we're planning for the worst, we're still working for the best outcome, which is no cuts whatsoever. I'm just gonna pause and take a look at the chat for a second. Yeah. Yes, that's right. Another way that we're seeing is for states to sort of delay sending funds that they're planning to send to districts. Okay. So let's talk about some specific state actions, right? Some states have already made cuts. I'll talk about 2 examples, and then we'll ask you to rate them on that inequitable to more equitable scale. So Georgia's the first one that I want to talk about. The state leaders in Georgia decided that they had to cut $950 million from the state's core education funding. And they said that they were going to, and that represented 10% of all funding, of all state funding. And they said that they were going to take 10% from every district in the state. So just putting real numbers on what that looks like, in Forsyth and DeKalb, which are 2 districts right outside of Atlanta, right? Forsyth has a 5% poverty rate, and the cuts ended up being about $493 per student. I calculated this, so I say about. And then DeKalb, right, which has a poverty rate that is more than 4 times higher than Forsyth, actually saw higher cuts on a per student basis at $542. On the other hand, in Ohio, we saw the state leaders there decide that they needed to cut $300 million. But they designed, and were intentional about making those cuts so that they would take away more funding from wealthier districts in the state, right? So Solon, which is a wealthy suburb right outside of Cleveland, has a 7% poverty rate, and the cut there was $300 about per student, versus the cuts that Cleveland saw at $109 per student, even though that district has a much higher poverty rate, right? So the districts with higher poverty rates saw lower cuts in this case. Okay, we're back to Mentimeter. So based on what I just covered on the ways that Georgia and Ohio decided to cut funding, let us know what you think. Were the cuts inequitable, equal but inequitable, or somewhat or more equitable? You can go to menti.com again and enter the same code that you used before. Yeah, Sue, that's a really great point. Oh, sorry, the code is 1261716. Sue, that is a really good point, that we have to monitor attendance and enrollment-based funding. That's right. I think, in this year is pretty anomalous, and so we haven't gotten too deep in the weeds on this, but what we would suggest in this moment is to just sort of hold districts harmless. So it seems, to defy logic to sort of make real concrete policy changes at this point when there's so much uncertainty, right? There's just so much going on that we just don't know how to deal with, haven't dealt with before. So, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that is how I would rate them, right? Georgia's method, which basically cuts, a flat percentage, right, from all districts in the state, regardless of need, regardless of local wealth. We would call that an inequitable process. And on the other hand, Ohio, which, was very intentional about making sure that districts with lower need more local wealth to make up for cuts, saw much higher cuts. So yes, Ohio we would call a more equitable process or solution. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna test this out again. Can everyone hear me fine? All right, so we just saw some real world of states taking different budget actions. Today, you'll be able to explore a web tool that presents the 3 methods that Ivy discussed for how state leaders might cut funding to school districts. So the web tool, which I'm for, presents the 3 methods and from inequitable to more equitable, shows their equity outcomes by highlighting the impact on a though the methods in this web tool are illustrative, they show the power that state leaders protect students with the greatest needs when making these decisions. So, who are having trouble hearing me. Send the link to the audio. The instructions are on the slide if you can't hear me. Send a link to this web tool. Sorry, one minute. I don't know if you need to maybe repeat some of the things I said because my sound, unfortunately, is not working.
Yep. So I just put a link, everyone, in the chat for the web tool. You guys can, so it's in the chat, or you can navigate to this address that's on the screen at trust.org/COVID -funding -cuts. And then you'll need a password to access the site because it is not yet live. It's still in draft form. And that password is no cuts. Once you get to the site, you'll be able to navigate. You can look at the national page, or you can navigate to your specific state. And just take a few minutes to explore the different methods and the implications of each of those methods on the highest poverty districts in the state. We'll give you guys a few minutes for that and come back in a bit. While we do that, I'll play some music for your listening pleasure. Okay. Bring folks back. Well, I mean, you can continue exploring the tool, but wanted to just, ask out loud if anyone's got any thoughts that they either want to share in the chat, or if someone really wants to, sort of share verbally with the group, you can request to share your audio and video, and we'll make that happen. I think, one of the things that I found most interesting here is that, and this sort of plays to the conversation that's going on in the chat right now about Nevada, is that, states with much more equitable funding systems have a lot more to lose or gain based on the way that they are designed here. Right, yes, I'm opening up the chat again. So exactly to Zahava's point, right? Like in states that send a lot more money to its highest need districts, like Massachusetts here, or New Jersey is another good example, we see that, the differences between what happens in the highest poverty districts, right? So the red bar on the screen here, in the first chart compared to the red bar on the screen in the third chart, right? There's a pretty stark difference there, both in terms of dollars per student, right? It's $903 per student based on our modeling. That adds up to $163 million, right? And that can make a huge difference in the experiences that, students, teachers, schools, right, and in particular in the highest needs districts have in this time, and frankly for years to come, right? Because like we covered before, it's taken states a really long time to just recover from the cuts from last recession. So, the things that happen now, the decisions states make now, can have a real lasting impact. So there's a question in the chat from Charlemagne, I hope I pronounced that correctly, asking whether the federal or state governments don't have the dollars, or they do and are not willing to do what's necessary to protect public education. I think it's a combination of things, right? I'll leave the federal government out of this for a moment, but like states, right, generally states cannot operate on deficits, and so there's a push and pull, right? Funding in the absence of being able to raise additional revenue really sometimes can be seen as a zero-sum game, and you just need the political will to make those more equity-oriented choices within a state. At the federal level, I think what we've seen recently, right, is just a serious lack of political will to provide the additional funding or step in and sort of set the requirements that that would incentivize states to behave in a way that is more equitable, that protects the highest poverty districts, the districts with lowest property wealth. So I guess bottom line, I think it's a little bit of both. Rachel, your question about how high poverty districts are determined. So in this analysis, we used national data sources. So we are looking at in each district, in each state, the districts that educate 20% of students and have the highest poverty rates. And so that's based on census poverty, right? The federal poverty definition. The sort of lowest poverty districts are those that educate 20% of students and have the lowest poverty rates. Okay. Just gonna go back to the PowerPoint with our last 2 minutes and just ask you guys to, go back to Menti one more time. Use the code menti.com is the site address, and the code is 1261716. and just, enter any sort of takeaway thoughts about your advocacy priorities in the state, given that the state maybe isn't thinking about making cuts right now, might think about making cuts in the future. And I will keep monitoring the chat while you guys do that. So there's a question asking about district data. So we don't have district-specific information, district-specific data that we're sharing for this. And that is largely because we recognize that state funding formulas are, different, right? They're very different. There are lots of intricacies, nuances, differences across states that we have not considered in this modeling. And, what we want this tool to do is to serve as a conversation starter to, really highlight the stakes, right? The differences in what we could see in cuts per student if states make, more or less equitable decisions about how they make those funding cuts. But if you go to the web tool, there's no spreadsheet, but the web tool has a feature where you can click a little button that shows you all the districts in the state, so that you can see sort of what the spread is, what that looks like for individual districts. So these are real individual districts in each of the states. It's just that we're not, because we want this tool to really serve as a conversation starter, we're not sharing that information publicly. Okay. Well, I think that's right. That just sums it up perfectly, right? We want state leaders to keep equity front and center in the decisions that they're making about funding cuts here. So I know we're at time. Thank you guys for joining us and bearing with our audio issues. If you have questions about this, more questions about this work, let us know. You can reach us at the addresses that are on the screen. For the folks that are still here in this session with us, I think we've got state team time next. And so for those of you who are from specific states, I think you should go to that session next.
We had a pretty good turnout. It was like 30
It looks like
folks.
there's, is there one person left?
Yeah, I guess. But yeah, I think it was 32 people total.
Okay, great.
Pretty good.
Okay, oh no, the numbers are increasing. Okay, I'm gonna leave so that people join and realize that they should not be here. For the folks who are still here, we're going to leave now. Thank you for joining us again. And again, if you've got any questions, let us know. Okay, bye.